Reform era of the early 19th century, increasing democracy in America through these different reform movements. This is a movement that will continue throughout the 1800s, will continue into the 20th century, and so on, continue into the post-war world. So the first area in the early 1800s we're going to talk about is religion. We have the Second Great Awakening happening in the early 1800s, and this is a movement where it's Americans' movement to readmit God into their daily lives. Remember, you had the First Great Awakening in the early 1700s, so about 100 years later we have the second. It really starts in Kentucky, led by different Protestant denominations. Most common new denominations were Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. They're created in this Second Great Awakening. Big feature is tent revivals. They have revivals outside in a tent outside of the church. One of the fathers of the modern day revival is this man on the lower right hand corner, Charles Finney. We're going to talk about Shakers on the next slide or two. So Shakers are created out of this as well. It's a religious movement. William Channing, he's one of the leaders of the Unitarian movement, a new sect of the Christian faith that comes around. And they criticize revivals for emotionalism. Unitarians are not really too emotional when it comes to religion. So he criticized the Unitarian movement for their emotionalism and appeal to emotions. I do put in here Richard Allen. Richard Allen is a pastor in Philadelphia in 1816. He was an ex-slave, and in 1830 he held the first Black National Convention, and they protested slavery. Gave the Black church a sense of community and purpose because it showed that this was the African American church was a nationwide church. So he gives them a sense of community. It really establishes once again for African Americans that we're not the only ones out here worshiping this faith, that there's a whole nation full of people worshiping the same way we do. So the impact of the Second Great Awakening, you have new denominations form. Unitarians, they believe Jesus is not the Son of God. Instead, he was a good teacher. You have Universalists. This is a universal salvation of souls, not just a select few. Mormons, they want to restore the Christian, or they want to restore the Christian faith to its original form. Reform Society, basically through the churches, not political reform. And churches felt that it was better to reform society through churches because you'd get a better society. Churches equal more morality and things of that nature. If you reform society through political means, they say that it's going to be more of an immoral and selfish society. So churches felt like they played a big role in trying to reform society and make it better. We get utopian societies in the early 1800s as well. These are separate from corrupted current societies. Remember, the ideal of a utopian society is to perfect society. However you see fit to perfect your society. Utopia means ideal or perfect society. Characteristics of an ideal society. I'll give you a couple here. Check this one out. Some people have said in the past that protecting life, liberty, and property is the ideals of a utopian society. How to go about doing that? Well, that's up for debate. So anyway, at one time, life, liberty, and property were seen as a utopian society protecting these things. Shakers. This is a utopian society. It's a spiritual, social society. They did not believe in marrying, and they did not believe in having children. So the group will dissolve because it's going to die out eventually. Another utopian society was Brook Farm. I think it existed from the early 1840s, like 1840, 1841 to 1845. And basically this society was created, and your task was what you specialized in. So if you were a farmer, you farmed. If you were a blacksmith, you did that. If you were a cook, you cooked. It didn't matter if you wanted to switch. Maybe a cook wanted to become a farmer, but in this society, it was very rigid and very strict. The society ends, I believe, in 1845 when their house burnt down. So the Oneida community, it still exists today. It's got strict rules as well, but it still exists today in upstate New York. It's still around. At least the house is, but some of the society is as well. Usually in these utopian societies, you're going to see strict rules, regulations. Guys, these utopian societies exist today. We have a lot of different forms. We have religious utopian societies. In American 2, you may talk about Jim Jones. He tried to create a utopian society. He ended up, they all committed suicide. You have other utopian societies. So they still exist today. Prison reform. What you need to know with this is, in the early days, we mixed our mentally ill with our violent offenders. This was a problem. Treatment and condition were all problems, and you're going to have a reading with this. Miss Dorothea Dix pushes for more humane treatment of the mentally ill, and she spends her life doing this. This is a good video that goes through it in about 9 minutes for you, but basically inhumane treatments of mentally ill people were happening in the early 1800s, and she pushes to separate the mentally ill from the true violent offenders. So education, we needed to protect the republic, and so they needed to be educated. You need to educate your populace. Horace Mann, the gentleman down here, Horace Mann pushes in Massachusetts for free public education. His efforts are going to lead to what is today a nationwide free education for you guys, a K through 12. So a more productive society and populace is an educated one, and this has been shown throughout history. The Greeks, the Romans, all of these societies were highly educated. So you may not like it, but that's why you're in school. And if you were not in school, you'd be in a factory somewhere. That's our history. So this is a famous political poster. If you look at it, it's called The Drunkard's Progress. And you see step 1 over here to the bottom left. A glass of wine with friends. They're jolly, hanging out. Step 2, a glass to keep the cold out. Step 3, a glass too much. Step 4, drunk and fightious. Or drunken flautist. Drunken flautist. Step 5, the summit is attained. You're jolly. Comparisons, basically a confirmed drunkard. Then you look at the path down. Poverty and disease. You're forsaken by your friends. You turn to crime. You're desperate. Desperation and crime. And look at step 9. Yeah. Basically in the end, and this is, got the gun to the head and everything, but when you look at all the health effects and stuff, you say, well, you kind of are doing some things to yourself. But yeah, this is a famous political poster from the 1800s. So the Temperance Movement. What we need to know here is the need for controlling alcohol and alcohol abuse. It's pushed for by women, mainly abused women. Okay, men were spending their money on it and not their families. Lyman Beecher, he is a preacher, and in 1824 he's going to start preaching about the evils of alcohol. This would later turn into prohibition. The temperance movement is called temperance in the early days, and then it goes through prohibition later. If you watch this video clip here, you'll see, It'll talk about our reliance on alcohol. Americans used to drink a lot more than they do today. You'll get that in that video. You can see that. But keep in mind, women were second-class citizens, so their whole economic status and their whole social status were tied to their husband. And so when their husbands would go out on Friday, they'd get paid at work and they'd go out and spend their paycheck on alcohol. And either they'd come home or they wouldn't. And if they did come home, they may beat their wife, they may beat their kids. This is the evil that women saw. So when you think of drinking, having a good time and everything, that's fine. But back then there was a lot of abuse because, to be quite honest, the man was the breadwinner and he was the head of his family. So sometimes when he was drinking too much, he could do some really bad things to his family. If you look at the pictures to the far right here, as you see, he's happy and jolly. At the end of the night, he's got a closed fist and he's hitting his wife. So this is what we talk about when we talk about evil and bad, when you hear women talk about this in this time period. So women's rights, the role in many of the reform movements led to the need for greater political rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are some of the early pioneers for women's rights. The Seneca Falls Convention in New York, Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848, women declared they were going to fight for the right to vote and for equal rights. And their Declaration of Rights is very similar to the Declaration of Independence, and it was done this way on purpose, if you look at it. So here's the Seneca Falls Declaration compared to the Declaration of Independence. So I've highlighted the stuff in red that are very similar. You need to kind of go through and read. So here we go. So if you look at the Seneca Falls on Declaration of Rights on the left-hand side, you'll see that they wrote in all men and women are created equal, where it says all men are created equal in the Declaration. If you go down, you see at the bottom, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government. Basically, it's right over here in the Declaration. It says it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government that's not protecting their rights. So Susan B. Anthony, she is one of the most famous women's suffragists. And because of her work and thousands of other ladies' work, African Americans, white, middle class, because of a lot of women's work, eventually they fight and they obtain the 19th Amendment in 1920. It's named for Susan B. Anthony, women's right to vote. The 19th Amendment's passed in 1920, but by no means do we want to use the word given. They fought for this right. They died for this right, and some of them starved themselves to the point of death in prisons for this right. So it's not to be taken lightly. So as far as the women's movement goes, it touches on a lot of areas. And another area here would be, as you see, Mary Lyon, she opens the first school for women. Elizabeth Blackwell becomes the first female doctor. She opens an infirmary for women and children in New York, I believe in the 1850s. Catherine Beecher, she's an educator down here on the lower right. She's an educator, and in 1850 she conducted a survey and she found out that 1 in 3 women were sick. You want to know, how are 1 in 3 women in the U.S. in 1850 sick? Because they didn't bathe. They didn't bathe regularly. They didn't exercise, and they wore very restrictive clothing even when they had to work. So these 3 areas here are why women were chronically sick as they got older. Keep in mind, bathing, families didn't bathe but once or twice a week back then, and typically if you had a family of 6 kids and a husband, of course the husband's usually working in a factory or in the field, so the kids and the husband get the bath first, and by that time Typically, the water was either cold because they didn't have running water, you had to heat it on the stove, or the woman was just simply tired.